but also in prompting many of us to actually join her challenge in reading around the world. So really looking forward to this conversation. Welcome, Suroor, and welcome, Anne, and over to you.
Thanks, Susha. Yeah, I've been following Anne's blog, a year of reading the world for a while now. Not only is Anne a voracious reader, but by now she's read at least one book from every single country in the world, as Usha just said, a project she embarked on in 2012. And she has inspired so many people to take this journey, including me and my friends, and Usha included. Anne, welcome to HLF Online. I think that what you did in 2012 was extraordinary. You not only read 196 books, it's 197 actually, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
In a year, but you did it while holding down a full-time job and found the time to blog about it. It's something you've continued doing. In your book, Reading the World, you write about the process and also raise questions about translations and whose voice gets heard. So we have a lot to talk about. Let's start from the beginning. How did you start this journey, and how on earth did you fit holding down a job, reading 197 books and blogging all into a single year?
Well, it really all started by chance. I never envisaged that this project would lead to a book, or that more than 10 years later, I would still be talking to people about reading books from around the world or doing amazing events like this. But it came about because someone made a comment which made me look at my bookshelves differently. I've always liked to think of myself as an international cosmopolitan person, but actually, when I looked at my bookshelves, I realized that wasn't the case. Most of the stories that I read were written originally in English. And when I thought about that, it didn't really make sense. I knew there had to be lots of amazing stories out there written in other languages. And I couldn't see why I, as an aspiring writer, would cut myself off from so many riches of the world's storytelling and really isolate myself in that way. So I decided to use 2012, which was a very international year for the UK. The Olympics were coming to the UK, as the chance to try and go out and meet the world through books. And because I realized I knew very little about much of the world's literature, I asked the world to help me and provide suggestions of what I might read. And in the end, people went much further than that in many cases. People went out of their way, were extraordinarily generous, sent me books, even wrote and translated books for me in some cases. And many of these people have remained friends to this day and continue to send me information about storytelling in different parts of the planet. So that was really how it started. And once I had all these people starting to get behind me and offer to send books, I felt that I couldn't really let them down. I had to honor their trust in me. And so their support, their faith was really one of the major things that kept me going. But in terms of the practicalities, I'm quite an organized person. And I realized that to achieve this, I was going to have to be quite organized. Once I'd decided how many countries the world that I was going to read included, which actually is not as straightforward a question as you might initially assume. And, you know, no one really agrees on that answer, depending on where you live. I ended up going for a list that was based largely on the UN recognized nations, with a couple of extras thrown in to problematize that and show that that list is not inclusive of every nation. So we had the 195 UN recognized nations plus Taiwan, which was a UN member, and then plus one extra territory, which I let people choose for me to represent all the unrecognized nations that weren't on the list. And that ended up being Kurdistan.
Right.
Excuse me, I have to apologize. I have a rather croaky throat. And so reading 196 books, as I initially thought it would be in a year, I added Kurdistan rather late. I realized was going to take, was equivalent to reading one book every 1.87 days. So wow. I realized if I needed to read slightly faster than I had to in order to be certain of getting through all the books, just in case something happened, in case I wasn't able to read for a couple of days for some reason. So I decided that reading 4 books a week was what I was going to need to do. So that meant reading half a book 6 days a week, and then 1 short book in 1 day on a Saturday. And I judged that the average book was 300 pages. So that meant 150 pages roughly every day, which I worked out would be about 3 to 4 hours reading for me. Now I was working at the time in central London, so I had an hour's commute on the train each way. So that was 2 hours, then an extra hour or so in the evening, or maybe on my lunch break. But actually the reading was only half the effort, because the blogging, the research, dealing with all the correspondence, that took us long. So I also got up very early, but I was very boring that year. I didn't really do very much. And when I was on the train, if I saw anyone that I knew, I would avoid them because I didn't have time to talk to them. I would hide. So I got quite good at hiding. But yeah, I managed. That was how I managed to make it work.
I would imagine that there were some countries that were really difficult to find books from, especially in English translations, and in others you had a huge choice. How did you select your books?
Well, it was not at all precise. This was very much a personal project, not a scientific endeavor. It wasn't an attempt to find the best book from every country or find a book that was representative of every country. I think that's a very difficult idea, very problematic. And certainly if that even is possible, I wouldn't be the right person to do it. Because if you've never read a book from Mongolia, how on earth can you say what is the definitive Mongolian novel? For me, it was about seeing what was out there, seeing what voices I could encounter. And so in some cases, it was about what people suggested to me. Sometimes it was several people suggested the same book, and that made it seem quite a compelling choice. Sometimes it was very much a book that wasn't the obvious choice, but something that caught my eye. So, for example, my Saudi Arabian book was a book that was pitched to me as the Saudi Arabian Sex and the City, which intrigued me. So I decided to read that, and it was a book called Girls of Riyadh. And you're quite right that back in 2012, and even to this day, there weren't books available in English translation from every UN recognized nation in the world. And that's significant because English is the world's most published language. Although there are more first language speakers of Mandarin and Spanish, when you add in second language speakers, English is by far the most spoken language in the world, and there are most books published in it. And because of that, books that come into English have a massive global reach, and they also have much more chance of being translated into other languages. So English really is a kind of massive gateway for stories. And if your work is available in English, you have much more chance of speaking to the world. So back in 2012, there were around 11 UN recognized nations that had no commercially available literature in English. Now, of course, the question of what makes a book from a country is its own difficult, knotty problem to unravel. And many people have different views about that. And I'm not sure I've entirely resolved it for myself. There are always exceptions and always things that test the boundaries. But leaving that aside for now, I could talk for an hour just on that. That left me with around 11 countries. And in some cases, people did extraordinary things to help me in those cases. There was one in the case of the Comoro Islands. There was someone who'd done a PhD and had, for fun, had translated a novel from by an author from the Comoros, and he shared the manuscript with me, so I was able to read that. But in the case of Sao Tome and Principe, for example, a team of volunteers actually translated a short story collection for me because there was nothing commercially available in English at that point. So that was that. But in terms of other places, yes, there were places where there was a richness. It was ridiculous to try and choose. India was the most obvious example of this. I mean, how ridiculous to try and choose one book from Indian literature, which is so rich and so vast. And I have to say, throughout that year, India really, it concerned me, it bothered me that on my website, if you visit it, you'll see the list of books that were recommended to me, and that list is all the valid recommendations I received during and immediately after that year, and then I add one book each month now as I continue to add one review each month, which I think is a lifelong quest now. But India, there are so many recommendations, and every time I asked someone to help me choose, they just suggested more books. But I was fortunate because someone who is one of the people who's become a lifelong friend, a woman called Sunita Balakrishnan, she stopped by the blog and she left a comment. And she said, I noticed that all the recommendations that you've had for Indian literature are books written in English. And to my mind, that's second best to what we have to offer in the many other languages spoken here. And she said, one of my favorite authors is the Malayalam author, M.T. Vasudevan Nair. So I suggest you try and find one of his books in English translation. And I thought that was a compelling point. She pointed out yet another blind spot in my thinking and the way that I looked at the world. And so I took up her challenge and I found a book by M.T. Vasudevan Nair and read it, Kalam, and thought it was brilliant. And actually, for me, that was really transformative. I've since read a lot of other literature in Indian languages other than English, and I really enjoy it. In fact, next week I'll be speaking to Benjamin, the Malayalam author of Goat Days in Dibrugarh. I'm really looking forward to that. I think it's a fantastic novel. And for Sunita, that was a realization too, because she suddenly understood how neglected Indian literature was in the eyes of many English speakers and in terms of translation. So she started her own project to champion Indian literature in languages other than English. And she does her own Malayalam podcast about literature. So it was a constant dialogue, a constant process of trial and error, a constant sort of attempt to challenge myself and to explore ideas and test things, and to accept that I was going to make mistakes and I wasn't always going to get things right. But that's part of what engaging with the world is, isn't it? You have to be honest about your own limitations, about your own blind spots and your own inability to engage with everything because it's so vast. And that is intimidating, but I think it's also quite liberating because it means that none of us can be an expert in world literature, no matter who we are, no matter how many languages we speak, no matter how many countries we visited. We're all come to a point where we don't understand at some point, and that means that we're all equal in that respect.
You talked about trying to figure out where a book is from. You raised that just now.
Yes.
And how do you, I mean, because I've been doing, as you know, like you've been much slower, and I'm doing it, much less systematically. But I've been sort of selecting authors from the country, but they don't always write about the country. They might set their book somewhere else. So did that kind of thing come into your?
Yes, I think my thinking is probably quite similar to yours in that for me it's about voices and mindset rather than about subject matter. I do know readers who are doing projects who require the books to be set in the countries in question. And to my mind, that feels quite restrictive because I think, British authors write books that go all over the world. So why shouldn't writers around the world write books that go wherever their imagination leads them? And I think that a Zimbabwean novel set in a kingdom under the sea or set in Scotland could be as fascinating as one set in Harare. So for me, it so happened that many of the books I read were set in the countries in question, but that's partly down to the English publishing system, which is quite limited in what it will accept for publication. And in many cases, publishers even today expect books translated from other languages to be set in the countries or set predominantly in the countries that they are from, because otherwise they don't know how to market them. And I think that is a big problem and something that I'm continuing to try and challenge, because I think that's really rather narrow, but it is better than it used to be, I think.
Yeah, have you seen American fiction?
Oh, it's brilliant. I really enjoyed that.
And
Yes.
that's quite interesting, because it's just what's exactly what you were talking about, because
Mm,
it's expectations, right? I mean, if he's a Black American author, he has to write about the poor Black American experience, so to
exactly.
speak, and
It's
there's no space for people like him who are, middle class
it,
or whatever.
exactly.
It is.
It's what I often call the authenticity trap, where people want books that feel authentic to them.
Yeah,
But the trouble is, what feels authentic to you may well be a picture that's been built up from images that you've gleaned from the Western media and
yeah,
very unrepresentative things, that so you just end up in a hall of mirrors where you see your own prejudices reflected back at you. And often, I think certainly in the UK, there's an issue with books that, because publishing is a relatively limited, it's still predominantly white and still predominantly a certain kind of person publishing books. It's what feels authentic to those people that is allowed to be published. And that is very narrowing. And exactly as you say, American fiction is a brilliant example of that. I mean, it's amazing that that novel was written more than 20 years ago.
oh, was
But
it? I
it
didn't know
feels
that.
so, yeah, it feels so fresh though. I mean, Percival
Yeah,
Everett's novel.
yeah,
It's amazing. Yeah.
yeah. So to go back to the your reading of Indian books. So you read Kalam for the challenge. What have
Yes.
you been continuing reading other things? Have you been
Yes.
focusing on, have you been, since you're talking about translations, are you reading
Yeah.
more translations now than books
Yes.
written in English?
Certainly, I mostly, when I read Indian fiction, it's almost entirely translated fiction now. So as I mentioned, I'm really looking forward to speaking to Benjamin next week. But Gitanjali Shree, who obviously
Yeah.
the Tomb of Sand we were speaking about earlier, I really enjoyed her earlier novel Mai, which I found really, it was translated by Nitar Kumar, and I found it a really touching exploration of motherhood. I also reviewed Gasha Gosha.
Mhm.
You have to forgive my pronunciation on the blog as one of my book of the months. I mean, I love, having said that, I mean, I think Indian English itself is a form of English that I particularly enjoy.
Yeah.
I love the musicality of it. I love the turns of phrase. When I was growing up, there was a very hierarchical idea of English. People talked about received pronunciation, as though there was this perfect English that arrived almost like a gift from the heavens, and then was disseminated throughout the world. Obviously, all kinds of problematic colonial baggage, embedded in that. And now it certainly seems to me that there's a much flatter
Yeah.
understanding, which I think is really good. And there are far more Indian English speakers than there are people who speak like me. So Indian English is arguably the dominant form of English, or one of the dominant forms. And I really love reading. What I'm enjoying more and more is seeing books translated by Indian English speakers, so they're translated into Indian English, as opposed to being translated so that they have to sound like a Julian Barnes novel or something.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's a fantastic thing. I really enjoy that.
Do you think that there are more translations? I mean, I think there are more, and I don't know if I'm being overly optimistic, but is there more, are there more books translated into English now than when you started out in 2012?
From Indian literature,
Not just
there
in
is
general, but
yeah, I think
also, I
there is
mean, I'm asking you both the questions actually, Indian
okay.
literature and outside.
I think it's true for both, actually. There is certainly a wider spread of things available. Back when I did a year of reading the world, French was by far and away the most translated language into English, and that's probably still the case. But the range of countries represented is larger. So I think there are, for example, most of those French language books would have been from European countries or from Canada, whereas now there is more representation for Francophone African writing, for example. Not a great deal, it's still a long way to go, but there is some more. Certainly in terms of Indian novels in translation that we hear about in the UK, I think there's more visibility than there used to be. it was, certainly it seemed to me back in 2012, very difficult to find Indian novels in translation. And now there are quite a number that are celebrated and marketed, and that's great. And also there has been, in the UK and Ireland, there's been a boom in translated fiction. So literary fiction as a genre in total has been declining in terms of sales, but translated fiction has been increasing in recent years, which is really encouraging, I think. I mean, not so much the decline of literary fiction, but the increase in the translated fiction sales is really good. So I think that's true. I hope it continues. It's really important, particularly I think as the world becomes more polarized and more siloed.
Exactly.
It's really important to have these disruptive narratives coming across the borders.
Yeah. But I wonder why that is, though, the sort of rise in translated fiction. It's great. I love that, having the access to so much literature that we wouldn't otherwise have access to. But I wonder if it's whether because people are traveling more, are moving to different countries, or is it just?
Yeah, I mean, I think travel seems to have slowed down since the pandemic. Certainly my experience and what I see in the UK is people aren't traveling generally as much as they were pre-pandemic. And maybe that's fueled a certain hunger to armchair travel. And I'm slightly skeptical about armchair traveling, because I think it's a bit reductive to regard books as sort of telescopes that let us see life in other places. Of course, there's an element of that. Of course, it enhances our understanding of the way people live in other cultures and other parts of the world. But I think it's not, the idea that one book should be an ambassador for its country is problematic. And so I think that has to be treated with, and again, it brings us back to that authenticity problem, which I think it is important to be aware of when we read.
Yeah, I guess one way of dealing with that is having a lot of books from that country.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good palliative for that, definitely.
And they're also, maybe it's the fact that I wasn't that aware of them before, but I find there are also a lot of small publishers that are focusing, bringing out like Charcoal Press, which we were just talking about, or Tilted Axis, other stories.
Yes.
And that's also really, I find that really heartening, because they publish books that the big publishers probably wouldn't touch.
Yes.
Whatever reason.
That's right. I mean, I think it goes hand in hand, certainly in the UK, with a sight chilling effect in terms of the bigger publishers. The bigger publishers are becoming increasingly risk averse because the industry has been dealing with serious financial challenges, and so the need to be confident that a book will make money is more and more pressing. And so books that feel risky or feel a bit different are often less and less likely to get a big platform unless they tick particular boxes. So the small presses are picking up the slack there, and they have been for a long time. Historically they've often been the route that amazing new books come into English. I mean, that Fitzcarraldo is an extraordinary example of this. It's a British publisher. They have published in the 8 years I think they've been going, they've published 4 or 5 Nobel Prize winners. So, you know, I kind of sometimes jokingly say that the Nobel Prize should be renamed the Fitzcarraldo Award, because it's just whatever they publish will be next year will receive an award. But yes, you're right. I think it is a good thing. I think at the moment that's the way that really exciting work is coming through. And I don't know if it's the same in India, whether small presses are the champions of experimental work in the same way, or how things work.
I don't know, actually. Don't have the answer.
It'd be interesting to hear
but
that. Maybe I can find that out next week.
Be. Maybe Usha can answer that question.
Yeah, maybe Usha can tell us.
Back on. The other thing, one of the things you talk about in your book is cultural identity. the link between cultural identity and writing, as well as the choice of language. And we were talking about translations and things, but how does this affect what gets published? Never mind what gets translated. It's like, for instance, there's certain points of view that are not allowed to be, like writers being exiled, or that's just one example, but also,
Yes, I mean, it's a funny thing. I'm at the moment, I'm working on this new book, Relearning to Read, and I've been working on the chapter about censorship and politics. And it's a funny time in the UK because the UK has gone from being on the index on censorship ranking of freedom of expression. The UK and the US have gone from, they've fallen down to the third position of being called only partially open. So because of government policy, because of various moves that have been made against journalists, and there's been a chilling effect on what you can and can't say. And so it's made me think quite carefully about freedom of expression and who we align ourselves with. And as part of this chapter, I've been in conversation with a writer in Eritrea, which is formally said to be one of the least free societies in the world. And it's been quite powerful for me. He shared some work with me, and some of the things he said about censorship have really made me think, because he in some ways is freer in what he can say than many writers, I think, in the UK are. And I find that very challenging. Yeah, there is I think quite a sinister shift in terms of which voices are supported, which voices are heard. And it's not as aggressive as people often, in most cases, being imprisoned for, saying certain things, but it's sort of a passive. Certain funding streams get reduced or cut down, or certain projects are wound up, and it becomes impossible for certain artists to continue their work or continue. It's made easier for certain sorts of work to go forward than others, and I think that is really concerning. So I think I find it difficult to talk about this in preachy terms, because I feel conscious that the country I live in is not doing well with this at the moment, and it's something that many people are maybe not so conscious of, and that's part of what's dangerous about it. So yeah, one of the things that I hope my book will do, which is, it's going to be a slightly disruptive, slightly hopefully warm and entertaining book, but also a bit disruptive, but will hopefully highlight that a little bit. So yeah, I think cultural identity is part of that. It's who you align yourself with. I mean, obviously, historically, there have been examples of Nobel laureates, for example, who haven't been acknowledged by their home countries. There was a Chinese writer whose name I'm afraid it escapes me, but China congratulated France on his win of the Nobel Prize because he lived in France, pointedly refusing to accept him as a Chinese writer. And yeah, I think many great writers in their day who are lauded by subsequent generations aren't necessarily embraced by their home societies, because many strong voices are voices that tell the truth, or that reveal some of the less desirable aspects of the world in which they live. And that means that those who are benefiting from those societies, who are usually the most powerful people, don't always enjoy or want to champion those people. So yeah, I'm not sure if that's quite how you expected that answer to play out, but I think it is problematic. I think it's important. And I know this is an issue that is, I think, with the rise of populism around the world, this is an issue that is becoming the case in many societies. But certainly the UK is not exempt from that.
Also, let's talk a little about language, the language in which the book is written. As you said at the beginning, that to reach a wide audience, you need language like English, for example, or even Spanish or French, but some of the people who write in these languages don't have that access to somebody translating them. And that's another way of keeping their work in a bubble, right? I mean,
yeah, I mean, you know, there's a kind of default assumption, I think, among English speakers that everyone will want their work to be translated.
yeah.
And maybe not. You know, maybe not everyone wants someone like me to come along and read their secrets, read their stories. You know, it's again an interesting issue. I'm a massive believer in translation. I think it is a wonderful thing. I think there is so much joy, so much connection, so much power in what stories can do to bring us together. And I've, you know, in the face of all the difference and difficulty that we are dealing with as a planet, as a human race, the potential of storytelling to bring us together is a source of huge hope, I think. And you know, but I think it's easy, again, as an English speaker to, and particularly for someone like me from a historically dominant society, to not be sensitive to some of the inequalities that have made maybe some people a little wary of Europeans barging in and helping themselves to their cultural artifacts. And certainly there's some interesting translators. Tilted Access Press, who you mentioned, they published a brilliant essay collection called Violent Phenomena, which is by translators of colour talking about their experiences of translating and some of the inequalities that are embedded in the way works move between languages, and how, for example, the historic assumption that a translator should only translate into their mother tongue, which is in itself a problematic term, means that it keeps certain inequities entrenched in the system, because it essentially means that it's only mostly European or Americans who learn certain languages. There are certain languages that Europeans and Americans don't normally learn, who go out and find books that they bring back to the mother country and translate. But that means that there are certain works and certain languages that are neglected because there are most kind of first language English speakers don't learn those languages well enough to translate from them. But it also means that there are certain translators who don't get to work or to do the work they want to do because actually they don't necessarily have English as a first language, although they may have excellent English. And actually, I found some of the most powerful translations I've read have broken some of those old rules. So I read a brilliant novel called Love Novel, a Croatian novel, a year or so ago. And there was something really charged in that language. It was set during the 90s, during a lot of the fallout from the war and the turmoil bound up with that. And there was a real energy, a real passion in the language. The rhythms of it were quite alarming and quite compelling. And there was something about it I couldn't quite put my finger on. And then there was an afterword by the translator, and she revealed that she was a first language Croatian speaker, and English was a language that she had learned later in life. And for her, translating that book had been a hugely personal experience because she had lived through many of these things herself. And so she felt the power of them in a way that someone coming from the outside and translating would never do. And it had been so personal and so painful at times that she some days had only been able to translate one sentence and it had taken her more than a year to translate the book. But the finished result was an incredibly powerful, urgent piece of work. And I think for me, it was a really powerful argument for reassessing some of these things that are assumed to be good practice. And that, you know, many of the people who advocate them are not deliberately being excluding people. They're not being prejudiced consciously, but they're just sort of parroting what they've been taught is the best way to do things without really thinking about the implications of that. And I think particularly in this day and age when English is such a global language where it really doesn't belong to anyone anymore, we need to think more fluidly about how how it works and who gets to use it, who gets to profit from it, and who gets to share stories in it.
Yeah, it's like you were saying earlier that some of the books, Indian books you read in translation were translated by Indians. And it really makes a difference because, as you
Absolutely.
said, somebody coming in from the outside might not pick up on some of the nuances. And, you know, if you're from the culture and your English is good enough to translate something,
Yeah.
then yeah, I mean, in the UN, sometimes we used to come, I mean, back in, I think things have changed now. But there was also this sort of, you know, back in the day, it was this emphasis on your first language if you were English mother tongue. Otherwise, you didn't, you know, you translate it into your mother tongue. And I agree with you. I think it's ridiculous because, yeah, it's such a common language that, you know, and the same goes for French or Spanish or whatever, you know, it brings
Well,
that
and also
authenticity to it.
Also, it makes an assumption about who the reader is.
Yeah.
It assumes that the reader is a certain kind of English speaker, whereas they may not be. And that, you know, I think that question of, again, this is something that I've been thinking and writing about quite a lot recently, but what is explained and what is left implicit in a translation is a really key reveal about who the publisher imagines the reader to be. Who is it included, who's at the center, who is the story being aimed at, and who is being pushed to the side. So there's a brilliant example of this. There's a podcast run by NPR called Code Switch, and it's about race issues, particularly in the US, and language related to that. And they talk about quite often this concept of what they call the explanatory comma, which is essentially a clause that explains what something is. So, for example, if you had a news report and you had Donald Trump, the Republican nominee for the next presidential election, that's an explanatory comma. But in mainstream American news, you would never actually get that comma for Donald Trump because they would assume that everyone knows who Donald Trump is. But if you had a Latinx superstar, they would always have the explanation, despite the fact that there are almost as many Spanish speakers as English speakers in the US, and that, you know, Latin American TV is massive there. So there's this unwritten assumption about who's at the center, who this is for, and who is just listening in. And I think, again, that's a really, once you start to notice who is being catered for here and who is not being taken care of, that's, again, very interesting.
It's actually related to that. How do you, I noticed that there's some writers who use words from their own language in the book, and there's not always a glossary. And this is something that has been discussed. I mean, the Deepa Anapara, I think, if I get, she wrote this wonderful book called what was it? The Gin Patrol on the Purple Line.
Yes,
about children in slum areas in India going missing. It's a wonderful novel, and the three children are at the center of it. But she uses a fair amount of Hindi words in her book, and there isn't a glossary. And some of my non-Hindi speaking friends had a problem with that.
Okay,
but I've listened to a podcast where she talks about that, and she said it was a deliberate thing that she did. How do you feel about it, as if you read something that?
Well, I'm interested, were those terms italicized in her work or not?
I don't think so.
Yeah,
I mean, I have the book, but I don't.
This is really fascinating. So there's a big drive now not to italicize foreign language terms in English published books, because that immediately is declaring that this is other, this is separate, that you, the reader, won't understand this. This is outside your area of expertise. And actually, maybe there would be a Hindi speaker who would be reading that book in English. Why not? You know, so why should that be a foreign term? I think that most readers, you will always get exceptions, but many readers have a higher threshold for difference than many publishers assume. And I mean, glossaries are, I'm not sure how useful. I rarely refer to them. I find that contextually, I usually can infer what something means, or I can accept that I don't fully understand, and that's okay, and that's part of the reading experience. I think it's great. I embrace that. I think that's the future, really. I do. I can appreciate that it can feel intimidating if you're not used to reading in that way. And something that relearning to read is about embracing not knowing in reading, about letting go of needing to understand everything, which I think we as English speakers are sort of taught to think is the way to read, that you get the right answer, you need to know everything that's going on. And actually, I think there's a lot of value in accepting that there may be some things that never resolve themselves in our understanding, but that doesn't mean that we can't have a meaningful interaction with a book all the same.
Yeah, I had that experience recently. I'm trying to read a bit more in French. So I got this book by Marguerite Yourcenar, and she's a bit more literary than the usual whodunits and the things I read in French. And I had the same experience. I didn't get all of it, you know, because even with the little dictionary by my side. And yeah, and it was, and I used to be someone who wanted to know everything and I want to understand everything. And with this, I realized that it's okay, you know, because I still understood the story, I understood what she was trying to say. And yeah, so I guess that's, it's interesting. It's becoming much more inclusive and more wide.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it has to be, and also has to be the way, if we want to succeed as a global society, if we want to work together, if we want to maintain and build contacts across borders, then we have to increase our tolerance for not understanding. That's fine. I think that's okay.
Yeah. I had, so in one of the epigraphs to your book, you quote Louis Busby. You say, reading is a solitary act, but one that demands connection to the world. I love that. It's just, and it's a reflection on reading in general and the way it creates empathy by taking readers into lives and worlds that we were talking about this, you know, that they don't know. But also a reflection on your journey and how has reading the world changed you?
Yeah, I mean, it continues to change me. I think it has made me much more alive to difference and difficulty, and to the richness of the world, and to the fact that many situations that are often presented in quite simplistic terms are usually far from that. To the tendency we all have to view things that are far away as less complicated, perhaps, or less real, and to try and to know that about myself and to try and work around it. There's a lot of and people talk a lot about biases and racism, and you know, there's a lot of negativity around those things, as there should be. But I think with that, sometimes people can feel frightened about owning those things. And what it's revealed to me, I think, is that all of us absorb biases. We all, whoever we are, wherever we've grown up, we grow up in societies that tell us that certain voices are more important than others, that certain perspectives are more valuable, certain kinds of people are more valuable or should be listened to more. And knowing that about ourselves, knowing that humans do that, and that we have a tendency to privilege certain kinds of stories or certain ways of speaking, certain formats, it's quite empowering, because it doesn't mean that you stop doing it, but it gives you the choice. It enables you to be aware and maybe to make an effort to extend a little more understanding or extend a little more effort in engaging with something that doesn't neatly fit within the categories that you're comfortable with. So I think that's what it has done for me. It's made me more humble. I think a lot more humble in estimating my own ability to understand things.
Yeah, because you also talk about one of your chapters is about finding yourself represented in some of these books and coming. Yeah, it was quite interesting.
Yeah, well, I think certainly when back in 2012, one of the positive things that has changed in British society over the last 12 years is there has been a lot more talk about empire and some of the darker stories connected to empire. When I was growing up, there was very little history taught around the empire, and what was taught was mostly very jingoistic, very sort of positive, and there very few of us heard anything about many of the atrocities that were committed in Britain's name, and many of the things that continue to fall out from that. And a good thing that has happened in recent years is that there have been a lot more histories published by non-white British people talking about some of the other sides of that story. But back in 2012, for me, that was really a story that was quite new and quite confronting to encounter in some of the stories that I read from around the world, the depiction of Britain's actions, quite justifiably angry and confronting depictions of what people had done not many decades before in my country's name.
Yeah, I think we're going to be ready to take questions now. Usha?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thanks so much. That was a fascinating conversation. And I understand some people missed the introduction, so I'm just going to very quickly do that again so that those who joined late know who's speaking, despite the fact that we have the names on the screen. So we had as our guest this time Anne Morgan, who's an author and literary explorer, if you didn't get that from the conversation. She's based in Folkestone, UK, and she challenged herself in 2012 to read a book from every country on the planet, recording her quest at the website ayearofreadingtheworld.com. She's been an author of nonfiction work as well as fiction, which again, some of the books were mentioned, but you can go back to our website and look for those names. In conversation with Anne, we had Suroor Alikhan, who has worked in communications as an editor and website and social media manager at the United Nations in Geneva. She also runs a book blog, which is called Talking About Books. And she too, inspired by Anne, started a reading challenge. I do see that there are questions and comments in the chat, but I'm going to use my privilege as moderator to ask the first one. And before I do that, perhaps I can just comment on one of the things that you called me out on, which is, how is independent publishing doing in India? And does it really do the more cutting edge or experimental work? And I would say yes, definitely. There are independent publishers, I think several of them, some which exclusively publish in regional languages. And I think they do struggle. I don't think it's a great market because it does depend on the reading public, but we do have some very intrepid independent publishers. I think Zuban Books is one of them, Seagull, both of which have been doing translations as well. So let me just move on to the questions. And I just wanted to go back to something you said early on in the conversation, and which was about, being very jealous of your time when you started the challenge. And I wanted to ask, when you set yourself a reading challenge of any kind, do you think it takes away a little bit from the pure pleasure of reading and just, reading for the sake of reading?
I can understand that. I think you have to follow your inclinations. You shouldn't make yourself a Sisyphus, pushing some rock up the hill and having your liver eaten out by eagles. It shouldn't be a painful thing. So for me, there was a great deal bound up with the curiosity of this and the excitement that I encountered from many people who were keen to see how this would go. But yes, I think it is probably possible to, when someone tells you you must read something, that does take the shine off it often, doesn't it? And I find now that I am quite careful not to allow others to dictate what I read. I'm quite sort of free range in my reading. I have to read quite a lot because I have to read for work, for my research, and for the blog. But I try to allow choice and enjoyment and surprise as part of that. But I think it's about knowing yourself and knowing what you can manage. So ideally not setting yourself something that's going to become miserable to start with. That's probably the key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have some questions on on the YouTube chat, and Kat Demore has been commenting, and she has a couple of interesting comments about the fact that she herself uses a lot of words from the original language in the text without translation, and maybe it was a personal choice, but her question really is about specifically, she is from Belgium and she's lived in France. She lives in France now and lived many years in Mexico. And she wants to know which authors you read from those particular countries. That would be Belgium, France, and Mexico for the challenge. Yeah.
Well, I have to confess, it's 12 years ago now. It's a bit like a literary Kim's game, trying to remember. Belgium, France. I would say if you want to know what I read from each country, you can look at my blog. The list is there. Each country name, you just click on it and you can see my response. It's simply that it's more than a decade ago, and remembering, I can remember many of the books I read, but it's recalling them. It's not necessarily very easy all the time. So I think that's probably the best way if you want to know which I read from each country.
Go back to the blog. Yes.
Yes.
And there it is on the screen.
And that's the book. So the list is also at the back of the book. So that's there as well. Great, but it's available for free online.
Yeah, it's a lovely cover. Thank you. So we have a question from Vijay Kumar, who's asking, are glossaries and explanatory commas expected by publishers for books translated from English into other languages? This is a technical question, but yeah.
That's a really good question. I mean, I have to confess, I don't know. And I imagine that probably depends on publishers in different countries. There may be certain countries that have a particular desire for those things over others, but I would suspect not. I would suspect that there is probably a greater tolerance for English terms in translation into other languages. But that's a really interesting question to explore.
Yeah, something for a researcher, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's an interesting question. Did you encounter any genres, writing styles, or themes that you weren't expecting from certain parts of the world? And I think just in piggybacking on that, I'm wondering also if genre fiction is less translated from other languages into English, other than Chinese. I do know of Chinese writers.
Yes. Well, actually, I mean, genre is really interesting because genre changes around the world. So we think we know what a crime novel is, but a crime novel isn't necessarily the same thing in a country where the death penalty is still used, or where police corruption is at a very different level. For example, in Latin American crime fiction, the neat resolutions that we're often used to seeing in Anglophone crime fiction don't necessarily read as very believable. So many Latin American crime fictions have much looser endings and much less neatly resolved, because that just wouldn't convince a reader in a country where there are so many issues with police corruption and so many things are left unresolved. I remember I did an event a few years ago with the Pune author Manjeri Prabhu, who writes, she has an astrological detective who uses Hindu astrology in her detective work. And it's fascinating to see how that plays into crime fiction. So I think genre itself, it can shift around the world. And actually that can be a brilliant way for someone to explore the world. If you're a fan of crime fiction, or you're a fan of fantasy, or a fan of romance, why not go and see what a polygamous romance novel is like? Why not go and see what sci-fi in the Caribbean is like? There's a huge range. In terms of unexpected writing styles, I think well, I mean, there were lots of things, and of course I only read one book from each country, although I'm continuing reading widely and featuring new books each month. But I think something that struck me was the books, a couple of books I encountered from countries where there was little opportunity for writers to be translated into English, which, as I mentioned before, is such a desirable thing for many writers. And that led the writers in question to attempt to write in English and to attempt to write in the style of bestsellers. So there was someone who tried to write a Dan Brown novel, and it was not a good novel. He was a writer who was quite well respected in his own language, but he had, you know, in an attempt to break out, he had made this choice, and it wasn't a good book, but it was interesting because of what it showed.
And sort of connected to that, we have a question from a member of the audience. If someone is interested in a specific genre of historical or science fiction, how can they find works in translation? Do you have a space, or do you have any suggestions of where they might look?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what I did initially back in 2012 was a lot of Googling around and trial and error. There are certain blogs that are very good, particularly crime fiction, for example. There are a lot of crime fiction blogs that deal with translation. There are also bigger translation sites like Words Without Borders, which tends to focus more on literary fiction, but also you can pick up some good recommendations through there or some places to start. Some countries have really good cultural institutes. Estonia, for example, has a cultural institute, ee.lit, I believe the website is, and you go there and they carry details of all the work that is being translated that year. But I mean, Googling has changed, hasn't it? Because it's less free range than it used to be. We're now much more kind of contained within our own algorithms. So that is harder. But I think it's a case of when you start to explore, you pull on a thread and it leads you further and further. So start to explore, see what you can find. Google the country name and the genre that you're interested in, see what you find, and go from there. Yeah.
You will find a rabbit hole.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I see we're at the hour mark, and I'm going to just see if Suroor has any last words or any last questions or comments you'd like to make before we close.
No comments, but just to say this was a really enjoyable conversation. Thank you, Anne.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah.
And I know you have to rush off. And...
Yes.
Yes, I have a baby who has just woken up. She's starting to sing through the monitor, so I have to go and get her.
So we will let you go then. Thank you to both of you for a wonderful conversation, and thanks to our audience as well. And I'm sure we can continue the conversation in other spaces. You can go to Anne's blog, leave a comment there, look at all the reading lists, and we have the next 3 years figured out. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.